Welcome back. This time we're talking about the fourth episode of Discovery Channel's new scripted show, Manhunt Unabomber, entitled Publish or Perish, which builds off the cliffhanger of the third episode in which the Unabomber sends a threatening letter to the New York Times and Washington Post, threatening to mail another bomb if they don't publish his manifesto in its entirety. And it's that struggle over whether or not to publish the manifesto, as well as the aftermath of said decision, that is the majority of this episode. Now, before I get any further, let me say this review will have spoilers for this episode. So if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you stop watching now, go watch the episode, and then come back and hear my thoughts on what happens, and then comment your own down below. Now, as I said, this episode is devoted to this threat from the Unabomber and the FBI's eventual response. Fitz wants them to publish the manifesto because he thinks it's going to give them clues by allowing countless numbers of people to read the manifesto and potentially see clues that would reveal that it's someone they know, a relative or close friend. This is not the view shared by his superiors, including Don Ackerman, played by Chris Noth. They toe the line that the U.S. government doesn't negotiate with terrorists and feel that by publishing it, they're essentially giving in to the demands of a terrorist. And it's within the context of this conflict that we see Ackerman head to D.C. to discuss the situation with Attorney General Janet Reno, played by Jane Lynch. And it's here where we get some very interesting parallels to the way Ackerman is treated by his superiors and how Ackerman and everyone else has been treating Fitz. Now, obviously, we've been dealing with the fact that they don't believe in what Fitz is saying. They don't believe in his science and his pseudoscience, since he's kind of making some of it up as he goes along. And basically they're more interested in him towing the expected line and producing evidence that fits the existing theories. And we pretty much see the same thing with Ackerman. We see his superior and they're discussing what they're going to talk about with Janet Reno. And it's basically the idea that Ackerman is expected to toe the line. And there's really two things that change his mind. First is the revelation that the Nathan R. clue is a complete bust. And then we also get to see the secretary use the would've phrasing that Fitz had mentioned earlier in the series. Now, obviously, this is based on a true story, and I don't know how close it is. I've mentioned that in pretty much every one of my reviews for this show. Now, the whole secretary moment definitely felt like a cinematic moment. Like, did that really happen? Then again, there are plenty of true stories where odd coincidences happen, and they lead to shocking results. So, I don't know if that actually happened. I don't know, honestly, how much of the individual events as they're depicted in this show actually happened. But as I was watching it, it felt like a very cinematic moment. And that's something that, for the most part, this show has avoided doing, having those clear-cut, just coincidence moments that make for good storytelling. Like I said, it could have happened. It may have happened. It was just one of the few times where the show felt like it went a little far in trying to tie everything up kind of neatly. Either way, Ackerman eventually makes the pitch to Janet Reno to essentially follow Fitz's recommendation, publish the manifesto, and then stake out the one place in San Francisco that sells the Washington Post. And it's here again where we see the bureaucracy of the FBI at play. As I already mentioned, we're seeing the parallels of how Ackerman is expected to toe the line just like he expected Fitz to toe the line. Here, he actually breaks from the line and makes a recommendation that neither his superior nor Janet Reno was expecting. And just some of the lines that Janet Reno says during this episode, talking about how he has moral courage, because it's not because she thinks that the idea is wrong, it's just risky, and someone is going to have to put their head in the guillotine if it doesn't work. And everyone in the room knows that it's going to be Ackerman. They're essentially saying, yeah, we like your moral courage here, but if this goes wrong, know that we are backing the heck up and letting you fall alone. And this is echoed later after the surveillance mission essentially fails to gain a suspect. when Janet Reno just casually mentions that it was a total failure and lamenting that it was a brave call, that's too bad. I love Jane Lynch's delivery in both of these scenes. You can just see that she admires what he's doing, but at the same time is not going to take the fall for him for taking this risk. And while I'm on the subject of Janet Reno, let me say this is another great example of hair and makeup work. We've already seen it with Paul Bettany as Ted Kaczynski, and now we see it again here with Jane Lynch as Janet Reno. Just some great hair and makeup to get pretty recognizable actors to look very unlike themselves and much more like the actual people that they're playing. So of course they go with Fitz's plan, and this coincides with Fitz's wife being in town. And I have to say, I was not a huge fan of this side plot, or at least the way they handled it. We know from what we've seen in the 1997 timeline that his family life is essentially in tatters, and it was implied that potentially he and Natalie had some kind of affair. What we get to see with his wife in this episode is she's there, she's very supportive, she's cleaning up the place, trying to get his mind off the case, putting up pictures of his kids. They have a nice dinner. They kind of talk about things. They go into the bedroom really quickly when he first arrives. And then he gets the call that they've okayed his plan and he has to go back to work. And she gives him that, go get him, tiger sort of look, and everything seems to be fine. Then we get to see her the next day when she arrives at the FBI office. Again, she seems to be very supportive. And then as soon as she sees Natalie, boom, she has just fire in her eyes. She's seeing something. Now, obviously, if the clue that we got in last week's episode is correct, there is going to be something. There is no sign that there is anything now. And it just seemed like very abrupt. I'm perpetually single, so I'm not going to talk about how realistic any of this is. It just felt very rushed. Now, I would not want them to devote any more time to his family life and take it away from the investigation, but at the same time, it just felt like such an abrupt shift, because the next time we see her, she's kind of giving him the, oh, well, I can go home, but I really shouldn't. That whole scene just, it just felt off, and it did not feel nearly as well written as what we've been getting in the rest of this show. So I was disappointed with that arc. Of course, we get to see him later at home, but we really don't get to see much of the wife other than just the strange looks that she's giving him throughout. Moving forward, we have the actual surveillance, and we have the female FBI agent, I can't think of her name right now, that is his partner, goes and ends up having to shoot a drug dealer. That was a nice tense moment. They've done a good job of kind of keeping the tension in both timelines going by giving us hints back and forth. And this is one of the few times, other than waiting for the plane to take off and reach altitude in the previous episode, that really had some situational, action-oriented tension. I also want to say that it was a really well filmed sequence with her going through the homeless area. I appreciated the shots. I appreciated the way it was edited together. I thought it was a very successful scene in what it was trying to do. Obviously, it was a bust, but it didn't feel completely wasted either. I didn't expect them to catch Ted Kaczynski. I know a little bit about how they caught him. I'm not going to spoil it for those that aren't familiar at all with the case, but I knew they weren't going to catch him at this moment. But they still provided some good tension on whether the FBI agent might get hurt or she might be forced to do something like actually kill the suspect. It was a nice little just action moment when this show is really more about linguistics and paperwork and those kind of things. So it was a nice diversion. It didn't last too long. It didn't distract from the overall story, but it was a very successfully crafted scene. So obviously it's a bust. Ackerman's going to be in trouble with his superiors. I've already mentioned what we hear from Janet Reno, and he comes down hard on Fitz and essentially more or less fires him from his work on the Unabomber case, sending him home. I thought it was a nice little touch when the other agent, I don't know his name either, was complaining about all the tips they're getting into the tip line and talking about angry wives and brothers with a grudge. If you know anything about the actual case, that was a nice little touch there. So Fitz goes home. He's trying to deal with being off the case. It's obvious that he's become obsessed with this case, trying to reorient himself with family life, being back at home and not being on the case. We get to see him help his son move the miniatures off of the dining room table, which his wife had complained about earlier in the episode. And then we see him in the middle of the night, and he has nearly lost it. And we see him dealing with the street light outside his bedroom window, and to the point that he goes out and nearly shoots it. And we've seen in the previous episodes where he is relating in some fashion to not necessarily the Unabomber himself, but some of what he was espousing about technology and how it has become a pervasive part of our lives. And that was a nice touch that they did there. And I will say, once again, that was a beautifully crafted, as far as the cinematography goes, scene. Seeing him pointing the gun at the lights, the sound where we were hearing the buzz of the street light, and that would drive me insane too. And then just that far off shot of him in the light, almost like that Poltergeist movie poster shot. And it just exemplifies just how alone and just bereft he is at that moment. It was such a symbolic shot without being too overly symbolic. And I just thought it was a beautiful shot. And then the music as it cadenced at that point was great. The music throughout this series, I have not mentioned it up until now, has been very good. It's definitely just, it's a score, it's a background music, but they use it so well to build these moments of tension that aren't your typical action beats. So of course the episode ends with this woman in Paris. She sees a newspaper article about the Unabomber's manifesto being published. She pulls it up on the FBI website and begins reading it, and then calls her husband and suggests that she should read the manifesto. And then once again, I'm going to harp on this because I love the cinematography in this episode. We cut to an outside, first we cut to her husband in somewhere in America, I'm presuming, and then an outside shot of his house, focusing on the house, and then it refocuses, so we get to see the mailbox, and the name on the side of the mailbox is Kaczynski. Boom, credits. I loved that scene. Again, the music built to just the right moment where we got that, mic drop credits moment. I love when episodes are able to pull that off, and this one did so well. This was a great episode because it had moments of tension, moments of character development, progressing the plot forward as far as the investigation goes, and we never left 1995. I didn't even realize that until the episode was over. We never got to see Ted Kaczynski except for his voiceover at the beginning, reading out his letter to the Post and to the New York Times, like all of the episodes have done thus far. But we never really get to see him. We don't get to see anything in 1997. We don't get to see any of the developments after Fitz's second failed attempt to get Kaczynski to plead guilty. I just love the way they were able to kind of show this greater bureaucracy at work and how his bosses are being treated, results in how they treat him, and we can see how that is beginning to weigh on him and why he would begin to relate with some of the things that the Unabomber is saying. They've done a good job of just kind of showing how he went from this wide-eyed, bushy-tailed rookie profiler to the very jaded, broken man that we get to see 2 years later. It'll be very interesting to see how that continues to progress and what happens with his family life. I'm presuming that the next episode will be dealing with that Kaczynski home. I hope they devote a good bit of time to that because that is an incredibly important part of the investigation and the eventual arrest of Ted Kaczynski. And I'd really like to see how that plays out. I do know how that works and how that helps the investigation. I also do remember when, it's this sort of this little nugget in my head. I don't remember anything in real specifics, but I do remember when they did publish the Unabomber's manifesto and how controversial it was at the time. That would have been 1995. I would have been 14 at the time, so the Unabomber really wasn't on the forefront of my brain, but I do remember that happening in real time. It was interesting to see how it played out in this version of the story. Once again, the performances were great. Sam Worthington is just killing it in this series. And I like Chris Noth. I like the fact that we got to see some of his home life, got to see some of the things on where his character's coming from, and then again, not to harp on it again, but just how this wheel of bureaucracy is just kind of grinding everyone in the end. So I really would like to know what your thoughts on this episode. What did you think about it? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some other reviews, and until next time, be careful where you write your post-it notes.